Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to view Mr. Harrigan's phone. So, I honestly want to state that this movie has something interesting in it, but it's smothered in being slow and boring. It's just, honestly, that is the way of which that this movie breaks down to me. So, this movie, of course, is conveniently available on Netflix, but I think by which I'm going to go on and explain this movie, this may interest people and just be like, oh, this is what this movie's about? Psh, no. Because I can understand that. Because, yeah, it's just. I would have to honestly just say that this movie's a bad film. Uh, but yeah, but like there's something about me that just wants to try and like say positive things about it, but it's just because once you get further and further in the film, you can understand why it's interesting. But overall, you're just like, but man, I had to get through a lot of crap to get there. I had to get through a lot of garbage. So with that said, teeing it up, what is this movie about? So Mr. Harrigan's phone is about a kid named Craig who is to read one day in church, and Mr. Harrigan is to see and hear this reading and really enjoy the way that this kid presents this story. And so Harrigan ends up going on to take this kid to his place to consistently have him read to him. And so the kid does so, going on and paying him money that seems pretty decent of a pay. So at first it seems just like Craig is going on reading these books and taking the money and so on and so forth. But it seems the longer that we go about this, the more Craig and Harrigan end up having conversations about the stories, starting to understand what the books are really about, and so on and so forth. And it feels like both of them are to go on and have a real rapport between one another because they become friends. Because, of course, uh, we have at one point where Harrigan asks Craig, it's like, why are you still reading to me after years later? Anybody would go on and find anything else to do besides read to me 3 days a week. And Craig would go on to be like, no, I enjoy this. This is something that I definitely want to come in here and do this. This is fun for me. So we go on to have Harrigan who's like, oh, okay, all right, like this is great. So it seems once we have Craig that goes off to this new school, it seems that we find out that there's a number of students that are all to connect together via their phones. And so, since Craig does not really have a cell phone, we have him go on to figure out a way to get one. But then he turns around and is to realize, well, wait a minute, Harrigan is my friend, and so I want to connect with him. So how would I go on and connect with him and figure out a way to have this be enticing for him to go on and use? And so Craig turns around and gives Harrigan a phone. So Harrigan at one point is to realize that how is it that all this information could really just be free? And so Harrigan is to go on and moan and groan about the phone and is to have at some point have that possibly being the real thing of where this whole thing is to go to. So when Craig one day is to be in a room of which that Harrigan had died, and then he ends up getting buried. Craig buries Harrigan with his cell phone, with, of course, Harrigan's cell phone. So we have at one point where Craig is getting these like weird, like unusual texts that like are to really like not make sense. The like CCAA kind of unusual like texts and so on and so forth from who is supposed to be a dead person. So Craig goes on to have at some point where, since Craig just needs somebody to talk to, he continues to just talk to Harrigan, leaving him messages, sending him texts. And so, come to find out, these texts or these messages start to lead to mysterious deaths. And then Craig is to realize, like, oh my god, like, maybe me going on and just desperately needing some kind of answer from a person who is already passed away, maybe there is something just wrong about this. Maybe I should stop. And the more and more Craig starts to further and further go into this story, the more it seems that Craig cannot go on and put this down, put it away, stop. And by the end of the movie, Craig then realizes that, like, maybe that is the one thing that he should have done all along, was stop. Like, just kind of move on. Just do something else. And so, with that said, because I wanted to tee this up really well, because I feel that there's a lot of people that are going to be disinterested. Like, to me, it almost feels like the movie Night Books with the girl who plays like Jessica Jones, and but she doesn't play Jessica Jones in this movie. But so we had like this young kid who goes on and reads to this witch, and then at some point, like, they realize that they can't leave the place that they're going into because of this witch. But so, like, I kind of like felt like it was kind of like that. But then also, I just recently saw the movie Wounds, and I was thinking, I'm like, oh, okay, well, like Wounds should be just like this, but no, it doesn't go into like a really hard, like, weird direction. But so, with that said, let's go on and let's double-fly this bad boy, because it's about that time yet again to, of course, go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time you spend to spoil this movie. Blah, blah, blah. So we have Craig at the beginning of this movie who's just kind of running. I didn't really understand what that was about. So Craig is to be a young boy, and he is to have lost his mother. And so Craig is to go on to state that his dad, at some point, like, it feels that he is much different since the loss of his wife. And it's like, well, of course he is, because what else does he have really left to be just happy about? So Craig goes on and goes to church, and so, excuse me, Craig turns around and decides to start reading passages of the Bible, and Mr. Harrigan just so happens to be there listening to this kid. And so we have Harrigan, who goes on to speak with Craig's father, and then is to ask, like, well, hey, like, I know that this kid was to, of course, speak at this church, and, like, I'm kind of curious if this kid wants to go on and read to me like 3 days a week for $5 an hour. So Craig takes this job. It's like, okay, like, this is gonna be really interesting. So Craig just starts reading to this guy, and so Craig is to also find out that this guy has a secret closet. And so Craig asks Harrigan, it's like, well, what's in this closet? And in my brain, I was thinking, of Batman Forever, when we had Dick Grayson's character ask Alfred, it's like, well, hey man, like, what's beyond this door? And Alfred says, Master Wayne's dead wives. Like, I was expecting some goofy thing like that, but we have Harrigan that goes on and just says, like, oh, well, like, it's secrets. And so Craig doesn't go in further and is to continue to poke at that and whatever. But so Craig goes on and is to continue to read these stories up until they end up going on and kind of repeating stories over the years. But so we have at one point where the first conversation that they end up having is to be a book where they end up stating about the horror. And so we have Harrigan that ends up asking Craig, it's like, do you even understand what you just read? And so Craig is like, well, I think I do. So they start to actually have like a rapport, kind of beyond just reading the story. They end up trying to figure out what it's really about, what the story really is about. And so then over the years, finally when Craig gets much older, we have Craig that goes on to have finally figured out the reason why there is to be this one book that has a certain specific title. So Craig then goes on to a school that, of course, is to be called Gate Falls, because I guess the town that he actually lives in doesn't actually have a school. So the town, I believe it's Harlow. So we, of course, have Craig who goes to Gate Falls School. So we go on and find that at this school, it seems that people are very attached to their cell phones, and I can understand why. I go on and have to know a cast list simply by looking through a phone, and so on and so forth. So hey, like, a phone could be very helpful, but also a phone could be very hurtful. Also, kind of when you go through like notifications for a number of things and find out that normally you don't get any or whatever, or if you go on you get some, it's to be like negative and you're like, oh wow, that was great, I went out of my way to read that. So Craig goes on uh to then immediately meet up with a bully who is Kenny Yankovich, who, when I was hear that last name, I was like, that sounds like Weird Al Yankovic, and I'm wondering if that's where they took the name from. But so Craig is to go on and meet with Kenny, and Kenny wants to haze Craig and is to tell him to clean his shoes, clean his boots or shoes or whatever. So we all of a sudden have this guy who's grabbing onto Craig, forcing him to do this, and Mrs. Hart rolls in. It's like, hey, what's going on here? So we have Mrs. Hart that knows what's going on with Kenny, like, oh, this is like some hazing that's going on here, right? Right, Craig? Tell me what it is that he's trying to give you. And Craig goes on to just state that it's like, oh no, it's just a sandwich, and he was just kind of curious if I wanted some, and I didn't. So Mrs. Hart is like, oh, okay, all right. So Mrs. Hart just walks off. So Craig starts to walk off also, and Kenny is like, what did you just do? And so on and so forth. And so Craig is to be like, well, dude, you should be thanking me because, like, I got you out of trouble. And the weird thing is, like, Kenny is not grateful for any of that. Instead, he's just more and more upset. What the fuck? So I'm just like, what an ungrateful little bit. That's what I want to call him. So we go on, and so we have Craig that starts to learn more about Harrigan, and they end up getting into a conversation after Craig finds out that Harrigan is to be a guy who's like an investor, and at some point this guy had worked at a job where like people had not treated him well, and they end up calling him the Pirate King. So we have Harrigan that tells Craig, it's like, well, hey, like, if anyone is to ever, like, treat you badly, like, you need to dispatch them with haste. And Craig is like, huh? And, like, Harrigan's like, dispatch them with haste. So Craig is like, oh, okay, all right. Whatever you say. So we have at certain points where Harrigan goes on and gives Craig these scratch offs. Oddly enough, I believe it's every one of his birthdays. So Craig goes on, and the first time he ends up getting one of these scratch offs, he goes and tries to get his lucky dime to scratch this off and doesn't get anything. So in a later birthday, we have him do this scratch off again, and he wins $3,000. And so Craig then turns around and calls Harrigan, and is to, of course, call him from his new cell phone that, of course, he ends up getting from his dad. Um, because, of course, Craig ends up asking his father about, like, well, hey, like, could I get a new cell phone? And his dad is just like, what do you need a cell phone for? And Craig is like, well, just in case I need to call 911. And like the dad has a joke of like, well, this town is so small that you could probably just shout the word 911 and they'll come running. So, but yeah, so Craig's dad ends up giving us a cell phone, and so we have Craig that is to have $3,000 in a cell phone now. So Craig decides that he wants to go on and do the right thing. As he's kind of looking at like the money that he has, and like he's looking at what he should do. So Craig goes on to get Harrigan a cell phone. And so Harrigan has already gone on when Craig is to call him through the cell phone. Harrigan goes on to say it's like, well, that has radiation, like don't go on and like consistently have yourself like be like have this be in your face so much you can get radiation poison. So Craig then goes on to give Harrigan a cell phone, and Harrigan's like, "Oh no, no." But then Craig is to justify the cell phone to Harrigan, and is to state that it's like, "Well, wait a minute, like you like to read newspapers about like stock, right? And your investments, correct?" And so Harrigan's like, "Well, yeah." So Craig is to go on and find these apps that Harrigan can turn around and read information that was posted today instead of tomorrow when Harrigan is to get this newspaper. And also, we have Craig who gives Harrigan an app so he can see his stocks in real time, shifting and changing. So we can have Harrigan be like, okay, like I can be more proactive about this and I can adjust things better. So we have Harrigan who ends up going on to get really interested in this phone, to where we then have Craig who is going on and reading a book, and it seems that Harrigan is distracted. So we finally have one point where Harrigan is to talk to Craig about this phone, and is to state that he is realizing that all the information that he used to get through this phone seems to all be free. And he's like, well, wait a minute. Like, technically, this information could all be free, but uh, what is the cost for eventually having like an ad that is to tailor to what I like, and to all of a sudden have it seems that everybody's going on and taking my information and using it against me. Like, how is this not going to be like the worst thing ever? And so, like, more and more Harrigan starts to get more upset with this. And like, we also have Harrigan that mentions that he doesn't have a TV, that he, of course, is to only have his radio being used in the car when he, of course, likes country music or westerns. So there's western music. I don't know. What do I know? So we have Harrigan that is to have this ringtone called Stand By Your Man, because he really enjoys that song. And so whenever Harrigan is to call Craig, that ringtone is to come up. So I thought that was really fun. We also had Craig nickname Harrigan Pirate King, and because I guess the newspapers would go on and call him that. So when it was a moment where like things weren't looking so well for Harrigan, but anyways, so come to find out, Craig would kind of Google Harrigan at one point, finding out that this guy isn't married, that he doesn't have any kids, so on and so forth, that this guy has like no real connection to the outside world besides really Craig and probably the housekeepers that he, of course, has lived with. So we have Craig that finally at one point, Harrigan has asked Craig, like, why are you continuing to come here 3 days out of the week still? Like, is it just an obligation? Like, what is the real reasoning here? Because Craig could just go on and find a girl or find some afternoon activity like a sport or whatever and completely forget about Harrigan. And Craig is like, no, I feel empowered by reading these stories, and that Craig is to mention to Harrigan how much he really enjoys it, how much he enjoys the company of Harrigan, and so on and so forth. So Harrigan is to really enjoy this kid also. So, and so at some point, Craig is to notice that there is some tank over by Harrigan's chair, and so Craig is asking like Harrigan, like, "Are you okay? Like, what's up with the tank?" And Harrigan's like, "Oh, like I usually take that when I need to sleep." And so Craig is like, "Okay, all right." So we go on to have Craig one day make his way to Harrigan's place to then go on and see that Harrigan is to have had this mask over his face, and Craig realizes that now that Harrigan is dead. So Craig is trying to revive or wake up his friend, and he's dead. So Craig ended up calling his dad and states that, like, yeah, like Harrigan's dead. So his dad is like, okay, like just kind of hang out there. Like, I'll call an ambulance. So Harrigan ends up passing away. Come to find out, I guess he has a heart attack and he is to die. So we have Craig that goes on and is to take Harrigan's cell phone and buries him with it. So we have Craig, who goes on to, like, at first just send a text stating that it's like, well, hey, like, I'll miss our afternoons together, to to of course um to of course Harrigan. And so, like, this kind of feels kind of like the one, like, Black Mirror episode, where the one woman is to lose her husband, her boyfriend, or whatever. And so she goes on and she is to have this service, and uses this service so she could talk again to her dead husband. And then it seems more and more we go throughout the episode, the more we realize that there are other things that she can go on and do to really bring him back technically. And so by the end of the episode, we find out that these characters are to kind of become estranged between one another for reasons. But you can go on and check out that episode if you kind of figure out what it was. The girl who plays Peggy Carter in the MCU, like, she's in that episode. But anyways, so Craig, back with this story. So we have Craig that goes on to be talking to a girl named Regina. It seems at one point Craig is to mention that Regina has a nice sweater, and Regina say thanks. And so the more and more they just kind of text one another. And so we go on and find out at some point in this movie that there's a possibility that Craig can go on to a dance, and Craig is possibly thinking that maybe some other girl is going to ask him out, but he's kind of hoping that Regina will. And so Regina goes on and is to just state, it's like, dance with me, and Craig is like, sure. So that means, like, he's going with the dance with her. So they both go to the dance together, and come to find out one day when Craig is to get on the bus, he then realizes that Kenny is dealing weed. And so Kenny is to have suspicions that Craig had ratted him out, but Craig could care less. So Craig gets on this bus. So when Regina and Craig are at this dance and they're having a great time, all of a sudden at one point when Regina is to mention that she's gonna need to go to the bathroom, we all of a sudden have Craig being grabbed by Kenny, and he ends up going on and beating him up. We also had another scene where when Craig had this phone, Kenny was to go on and say, it's like, well, hey, like, you want to see my phone? And then he's like, oh, I don't have one. Can I use your phone though? And so Kenny takes Craig's phone and is almost tempted to, like, walk away with it, and Craig takes it back. So, but anyways, this is to kind of escalate to a further thing. So Craig tries to punch out Kenny, but this is all for naught, as Kenny ends up winding up on the ground with Kenny's, like, boot over Craig's face. So we go on to have Miss Hart find the aftermath of Kenny as he's kind of bruised. And so we have Miss Hart that's like, well, hey, this kid's already expelled. Like, do you want to have him be brought up on charges? And Craig is like, I don't think I want to do that, because I would have to go to, like, court, and, like, I would have to do all of these things to just go on. and like have people like kind of look at me differently, or just kind of look at me like in not in a good light. So Craig is like, yeah, I don't know if I want to do any of that. So we go on and have a heart to heart between Miss Hart and Craig. And Craig has really mentioned that Mrs. Hart has really helped him out throughout the years, and he really appreciates her. And she's like, oh, yeah. So like this unusual moment between the two of these characters. So we go on to have Craig, who is to go on and call Harrigan and leave him a message stating that he ended up getting beaten up by Kenny, and he ended up doing what Harrigan said was to kind of dispatch him in haste. So Craig got one good hit in, but like he's afraid that Kenny will come back and maybe do something worse. And so that fear, of course, is to then all of a sudden have us find out that Craig was to die via an accident. Come to find out, they show the image of this guy having like a broken neck, and so Craig is to now possibly think that somehow, some way, the ghost of Mr. Harrigan took care of Kenny. And so Craig is like, oh my god, I didn't want him to die. So, but come to find out, when Craig goes on to meet with the housekeeper, and the housekeeper is to go on and be like, well, like, do you want anything from this house? And Craig is to be like, no, I already got like $800,000 from this guy. Because come to find out, after the whole funeral, we have a lawyer of Harrigan's that goes on and gives Craig this letter from Harrigan. Come to find out, Craig is to realize that that Harrigan had left him $800,000 in his trust, and that at some point when Craig will become old enough to be able to use this money, it should go on to have invested itself into almost being $1 million. So this kid will be fairly rich by the time that he gets this money and uses it. So we have Craig that goes on and is talking to this housekeeper, and he ends up stating like, well, maybe I'll take an orchid or something, just some little memento to remember Harrigan by. And so the housekeeper is to go on and mention that like some stories about Harrigan, and how like you shouldn't go on and be on his bad side. And we had Craig was like, what do you mean by that? So come to find out, Craig would find about this housekeeper that went on and stole from Harrigan. And so come to find out, Craig went on to find out where this guy lived. And so all of a sudden we have this old lady that is stating that Dusty, the guy that stole from Harrigan, went on to go into his garage and kind of rev the engine and stuff like that within his garage to let the gas come in, and to have killed himself in his garage. So we have Craig who's like, oh my god, maybe this is the connection. Every time something goes horribly wrong with Harrigan, he ends up somehow supernaturally killing people. So we go on to have Craig, who's wanting to go on and get an updated cell phone, hoping that he will no longer have the ability to talk to Harrigan again because the temptation becomes too real. So Harrigan goes on to get accepted at this college, and so we have Craig that goes on to uh, go to college as we have that really tender moment between Craig and his dad, who's just like, "Man, I'm just so happy that you're going on and like you're doing all this," and because Craig has this aspiration of becoming a screenwriter, and so Harrigan like could not accept um, Harrigan becoming a screenwriter because it's like, well, that means you're going to go and do a movie, and so like Harrigan just believed that like a book is just a far just better story than any movie that can be put out, but still. So we have Craig that goes on and studies really hard, and it seems like he's doing well within the school, and he is to have this very interesting roommate. So Craig goes on and thinks nothing of his past and so on and so forth, just kind of focusing on his college. So all of a sudden, we have Craig's father then ends up calling him one day to give him some bad news. So the one teacher that had really gone on and helped Craig throughout the years was Mrs. Hart, and come to find out, Mrs. Hart had gone into a car accident with her lover of that time. So come to find out, the accident had happened because of a guy who was a drunk driver, it seems. This guy was to be opening up this bottle of alcohol to try to drink it, and he was to try to find the cap the for the alcohol. And so we all of a sudden have this guy who causes this accident, kills Mrs. Hart, but this guy walks out unscathed. And so all the students, as well as Craig, is hoping, like, well, I hope this guy gets his justice. I hope he gets what he deserves. It comes to find out this guy tries to go on and go into rehab, but it's one of these high-end, rich rehabs, so it feels like this guy is to be in luxury and not in chains. So Craig really feels that this guy did not get the right justice, is to then be tempted to get back to his old phone to talk to Harrigan again, to then want uh, this one guy who, of course, is to be Dean Whitmore. Um, he wants him dead. So Harrigan calls, or Craig calls Harrigan to want him dead. So come to find out, we have Craig who realizes that this was a massive mistake. And so Craig is to start to look into uh, anyone who is to have been dead, and continues to search throughout this through a number of days, going through uh, lists of people who had died recently, so on and so forth. So come to find out, Craig is to find out through a guy that Whitmore had died. And so Craig is to go on and pay this guy $200 to get this information. And so what ended up happening is the guy was to go into this shower and eat a bar of soap, choke on it, and die. And the soap was to be Booth Bay or Bath Bay. And so come to find out, that of course would be the soap that Craig would have realized that Mrs. Hart uses, as she is to have had a scent. So we have Craig that asks, like, well, did he leave like a note or something? And so the guy is to tell him what the note stated, and so Craig is like, "Oh my god, that's lyrics to a song." So connecting all of this together, we then have Craig who's mortified about the decision he is going on to make or had made. So we go on and then finally have it where Craig goes on to go to Harrigan's grave, as he has gone on previously before in this movie, to try to see if the cell phone is to go on and make a sound. So, or maybe because we had like Craig who used to think that Harrigan is still alive down there. Maybe they made a mistake because of the weird goofy text. So in that did I mention in the note that Harrigan gave Craig, it stated that it's like, well, hey, I liked our weekend, or I liked our afternoons together too. Having Craig assume that Harrigan had, oddly enough, like tried to reach out to him through the grave, and that was such a weird thing, weird, goofy thing. So, but Harrigan is to now be with Craig at his grave. So Craig talks to Harrigan, like basically as if he's there, but he's dead. So Craig is to realize that there was a text that said CCCST, whatever that, like, I thought it was CCCAA, whatever that meant. So, come to find out, Craig would make the clear consensus that what was to be coming through those texts was really for Craig to stop. And so now we have, of course, Craig that is to realize that he should, that he will. So Craig goes on to take this phone and chucks it into this lake or this pond or this body of water somewhere. And then Craig is almost hesitant to take his own phone because Craig at one point was to get an upgraded phone, but he kept the old one. So we have Craig who's like, maybe I should throw this in the lake also, but he realizes no, like, I need this phone. So we really have Craig who's starting to realize like what reasonably Harrigan had said before about like we're gonna need these phones and so on and so forth, and we're gonna be so glued to them, and we're not gonna be able to stop. So it really comes down to like there being some kind of like message here, or some kind of like secret thing. Speaking of secret, Craig is to go on and go into that room that Harrigan was to say was secret. So he found a bunch of pictures there. He found a bunch of interesting things in there after Harrigan had died, and so yeah, like that was really interesting and whatever. But didn't really lead into anything. But so, with that said, I think that goes on to cover most of this film. And so, with that said, I think I'm just going to go on and get out of here. We have certain moments where Craig is to remember his mother throughout this film. We have at certain points where when Craig is to drive off and see his dad in the rearview mirror, he also sees his mother. We also have a point where Craig is to see these flowers and is to remember that he had these flowers upon his head while being with his mother, as they were kind of playing around at some moment. So yeah, like we have Craig being haunted by his mother also, as well as being haunted by Harrigan. So we had a moment also where Craig was to tell like Harrigan if he's really there to like knock 3 times, and he never did. But it seems that there might have been a response. We had a number of people convincing Harrigan that maybe this guy's phone was just hacked into somehow. Like we had the Reverend convincing Craig of that, or Craig's own father, and so on and so forth. And so Craig was just, well, yeah, maybe that is what it is. Uh, we also had Craig's father that was mentioning how Craig's mother is going to roll uh, in her grave after finding out that Craig is doing scratch offs uh, and like doing this job. And so Craig tries to understand what that means by rolling in your grave. That's the old story of just like, well, hey, like, if somebody doesn't go on and like what's going on after they're long and dead, they might roll in their grave because they are to be disgusted about something that happened to whatever it is that they had after they died, or whatever happened after they died. So, with that said, I think I'm going to go on and just get out of here and roll out of here. So, with that said, goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Let me know in the comments below if you went on and saw this movie, or if you didn't see this movie and you're reluctantly like, yeah, good thing that I didn't go on and see this movie because I heard what he had to say and I avoided it. I'm like, oh, okay, all right. So, with that said, I'm just going to go on and try to get out of here. So, goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.